Have you ever felt insecure in your own home? What would you do if a neighbor accused you of a crime just for being who you are? Would you dare to confront the police to defend yourself, knowing that the whole neighborhood is watching? I never imagined I would have to go through something like this, but a racist neighbor put me in that situation. The sound of the doorbell pulled me out of my reading. I glanced at the clock. It was around 9 p.m., and the only person who usually came that late was my friend Roll, but it wasn't his habit to show up unannounced. I left the book on the table and stood up to open the door. When I opened it, I didn't expect to see two police officers with serious, almost cold expressions. "Good evening," one of them said in a tone that made it clear something was wrong. "Are you Mr. Carlos Mendez?" I nodded, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern. The last time I had any contact with the police had been years ago, and they hadn't even taken me out of a complicated situation. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" "We received a call from your neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, reporting an incident at your residence. He asked us to verify your identity and, if necessary, ask you to leave the house." The word incident echoed in my head, but I didn't understand what they meant. I looked toward my neighbor's house, which was right next door. Mr. Rodriguez, an older man, had always seemed friendly on the surface, but his behavior had been distant, even in the few exchanges we'd had. We were never exactly friends, but we weren't enemies either. "Incident?" I repeated, trying to understand. "Are you sure there's a problem here?" The officers exchanged looks, and one of them, the younger one, stepped forward a little. "What we've been told is that you're in your house illegally. Mr. Rodriguez claims you don't live here, that you're an illegitimate tenant, something related to your residency status. Is that true?" At first, I didn't understand what they were saying, but little by little, the situation began to take shape. Mr. Rodriguez knew me. He knew I had lived in this neighborhood for over 10 years, that my papers were in order, and yet he had deliberately chosen to invent a story involving me in something illegal. My first thought was a wave of disbelief. Why would anyone want to do something like that? What would he gain from accusing me of something that wasn't true? "Can I talk to him?" I asked, somewhat nervously. The young officer nodded and gestured to Rodriguez's house with his head. I went straight to the door of his house, not knowing what to expect, but with the firm conviction that I needed to clarify the situation as soon as possible. I rang the doorbell, and it sounded sharply as I waited. Finally, the door slowly opened, and Mr. Rodriguez's face appeared, a look of disdain written on it. I wasn't surprised. He had always been a man who showed little interest in others, especially if they didn't share his beliefs. "Carlos," he said in a cold, calculated voice. "What are you doing here? What's going on, Rodriguez?" I replied, a mix of surprise and anger. "Why are you calling the police?" "I haven't done anything." He looked me up and down without changing his expression. He took a long breath before answering. "You? Here in this neighborhood, occupying a house that doesn't even belong to you. You have no right to be here." My eyes widened in shock. I could feel my heart beating faster as I tried to process his words. "What are you talking about? This house is mine, and I've lived here for years. What makes you think I have to leave?" The response was as direct as it was hurtful. "I don't mean that, Carlos. You're a burden to this neighborhood. People like you shouldn't be in places like this." The words hit me like a bucket of cold water. A burden? People like you? Instantly, I understood what he meant. People like me, someone of Latin descent, someone who didn't fit into his ideal image of what a respectable neighbor should be. His racism, as subtle as it was hurtful, finally came to the surface. I stayed silent for a moment, looking into his eyes, searching for any sign of regret or doubt. But there was none, only contempt. "Do you really think you have the right to speak to me like that?" I asked, now more upset. Mr. Rodriguez didn't say anything else, but I could see the satisfaction on his face. He knew that his call to the police had been the first step in what he expected to be a victory. I returned to the door where the officers were waiting. The older officer looked at me with a mix of confusion and indifference, clearly doubting what was happening. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I took a deep breath and let out an ironic laugh. "I don't know. I think my neighbor just tried to kick me out of my house for being who I am." Both officers looked at each other without fully understanding. "Do you think that's what happened, sir?" asked the younger one, as if he couldn't process that something so absurd could be going on. I didn't know how to respond. In my mind, it all seemed like a bad dream. But there I was, with the officers in front of me, knowing I had to fight to keep my home, to defend what was mine, even if that meant confronting a part of society that still hadn't understood that we all deserve the same respect, no matter our skin color, our origins, or our beliefs. Finally, the older officer sighed. We'll review the situation, but I recommend you call us immediately if anything else happens. Don't let anyone do this to you. And so, in that moment, something changed within me. What seemed like a simple dispute between neighbors turned into a fight for something bigger. My dignity, my right to be in a place where I had always belonged. As the officers walked away, my mind kept spinning. I knew the incident with Mr. Rodriguez wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't the first time I had faced subtle racism, and although it had never been this direct or explicit, now it seemed like I was dealing with something much more personal, something more insidious. When I returned home, the feeling of invasion was palpable. It felt like my very life was being questioned, like my place here in this neighborhood, in this city, was no longer as safe or as clear. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment. The silence of the house enveloped me. The sound of the air conditioning working in the background seemed like the only constant presence. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Rodriguez's words. People like you shouldn't be in places like this. How had he come to believe he had the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't? How was it possible that there were still people who thought this way in the 21st century? I walked to the kitchen and made myself a coffee, even though I had no desire to drink it. My hands trembled slightly. The thought that someone could make such a serious decision, so arbitrarily, without any real justification, overwhelmed me. But there was something else, something that kept me awake and drove me to keep thinking. I couldn't stay silent. The next day, I woke up early before the sun came up and began to organize my thoughts. It was clear that this wasn't just a personal issue. It was a manifestation of something much bigger. Systemic racism that, despite progress, still lurked in the shadows of society. However, I couldn't let that shadow envelop me, nor would I allow myself to be intimidated by one person's ignorance. So I decided to take action. That afternoon, I gathered my courage and headed to the office of the lawyer I had consulted a few years ago. He was a good friend, had always given me solid advice, and I knew his experience with discrimination cases could be helpful. When I arrived at his office, I found him reviewing some papers. "Carlos, it's good to see you. How are you?" He greeted me with a smile. Although his face showed kindness, I could tell something worried him when he saw how tense I was. "Jorge, I need your help. Something is happening in my neighborhood, and I don't know how to handle it." I told him everything that had happened, from the moment Mr. Rodriguez called the police to the conversation we had at his door. Jorge listened attentively, without interrupting, but as I shared the details, I could see his face change from concern to indignation. "Carlos, this is serious. What you're going through isn't just a personal violation. It's a manifestation of a much bigger problem. We can't let this be just a misunderstanding." We talked for hours, and Jorge explained the possible legal paths I could take. I could file a formal complaint against Mr. Rodriguez for discrimination, which would open a legal file that, while not guaranteeing immediate consequences for the neighbor, would send a clear message to the community that racism would not be tolerated in its most explicit form. At first, I had doubts. I thought maybe I should just let it go, that the conflict wasn't worth it. But something inside me told me I couldn't stay quiet. Not just for me, but for everyone else who, like me, was somehow made invisible in situations like this. "Let's do it," I said finally, with firm determination. "I don't want this to go unpunished." In the following days, a chain of events unfolded that I never imagined. The news of the complaint quickly spread among the neighbors. Some supported me, others kept their distance, but what really surprised me was how many people came forward to offer their help. Many of them, from different backgrounds and contexts, shared a similar frustration, though in less explicit ways. They too knew what it was like to be treated as a stranger in their own community. One of my closest neighbors, Pedro, a man of Peruvian origin, called me one afternoon. "Carlos, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Something similar happened to me with Rodriguez a few months ago. It didn't go as far as now, but he's always had strange attitudes towards those of us who aren't from here, you know? His confession left me stunned. It wasn't just Rodriguez as a solitary racist. It seemed that his behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader attitude in the neighborhood. However, what truly surprised me was Pedro's willingness to join me in the complaint. "Let's do it together," he said. "If we don't, it's going to keep happening." So, little by little, a group of neighbors started gathering. Some shared stories of everyday microaggressions, others tales of more explicit moments of discrimination. In the end, what started as a personal struggle became a community cause. The neighborhood was no longer just a place where we lived. Now it was a space where we shared the same concerns and struggles. The court hearing was tense, but determined. Rodriguez's lawyer tried to downplay the matter, suggesting it was all a misunderstanding, that the accusations were unfounded. However, the testimony of the neighbors, the evidence, and the documented incidents began to form a clear picture of what had really happened, a pattern of discriminatory attitudes based not on facts, but on deeply rooted prejudices. When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of my family's history on my shoulders. I had heard so many times in my life that I didn't belong in certain spaces, that I didn't deserve what I had achieved. That voice of doubt had accompanied me for many years. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't let those words of dismissal dominate my life. With conviction, I told what had happened that night, how Rodriguez had decided, with nothing more than his hatred, that my existence in that neighborhood wasn't valid. In the end, my voice didn't tremble. What once seemed like an impossible challenge to overcome now felt like an inevitable victory. When the judge rendered the verdict, it was clear. Rodriguez had to face consequences for his actions. The community had spoken, and, most importantly, I had spoken. Life didn't go back to the way it was after that. Although Mr. Rodriguez never spoke to me again, something changed in me. My perception of others, of my neighbors, and of my own place in the world was completely transformed. I was no longer just a man fighting against an injustice. Now, I saw myself as a vital member of a community that, though fragmented, was willing to unite to fight for what was right. Beyond the legal victory, I understood that true change doesn't come from a court ruling, but from the collective will of people to confront injustices that often lie beneath the surface. No one expected that the small act of resistance against one person would have such a big impact, but that was the lesson I took away. The struggle wasn't just mine. It was of all those who had stayed silent for too long. After the court ruling, the neighborhood fell into an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the kind of change that's celebrated with fireworks or emotional speeches. It was a subtler change, one that could be felt in the furtive glances of some neighbors, in the hasty greetings at the corner store, in the conversations that fell silent when I walked by. On one hand, there were those who looked at me with respect, even admiration. People like Pedro and other neighbors who had joined the cause made me feel that what I had done wasn't in vain. But on the other hand, there were those who watched me with suspicion, as if I had uncovered something that was better left hidden. I wasn't surprised. Racism never acts alone. It leans on the comfort of those who prefer to look the other way, of those who don't consider themselves racist, but do nothing to stop it. What did surprise me was what happened next. 2 weeks after the verdict, Mr. Rodriguez put his house up for sale. He didn't make a big announcement or say goodbye to anyone. One morning, a for sale sign appeared in his yard, and a few days later, cars of potential buyers started parking in front of his house. One afternoon, while I was watering my plants, I saw a real estate agent leaving with a couple inspecting the property. Rodriguez was standing at the door, arms crossed, watching everything in silence. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in his eyes, no fury. What I saw in his expression was something different, a mixture of resignation and defeat. He had lost this battle, but beyond that, his world had changed in a way he hadn't expected. He realized he could no longer impose his rules or his prejudices without facing resistance. He realized his time in that neighborhood had come to an end. I didn't feel joy seeing him leave. I'm not the type to celebrate someone else's misfortune, but I did feel a sense of relief. Not because of his departure, but because it meant fear no longer dictated the rules in that place. However, his departure didn't mean the problem had left with him. One Sunday, while I was having coffee at the neighborhood cafe, Donna Rosa, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood her entire life, approached me. She was one of those people who always greeted everyone with a smile and who knew everyone, but who rarely got involved in conflicts. "Carlos, may I sit down?" she asked in a calm voice. I nodded, inviting her to sit. "I want to tell you something. I don't want you to think that everyone in the neighborhood thinks like Rodriguez." "I know, Donna Rosa," I replied, trying to reassure her. She sighed and stirred her coffee with a spoon, as if she were searching for the right words. "What you did was brave. But I'll tell you something you might not want to hear. There are people who think you went too far." I wasn't surprised, but it did sting a little to hear it. "Went too far?" I asked calmly. "For defending my right to live in peace." "I'm not saying you were wrong," she said quickly, "but people aren't used to seeing this kind of thing here. They're uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because a racist had to face the consequences of his actions?" Donna Rosa fell silent for a moment, then sighed. "People are afraid of change, Carlos. Not because they want to be unjust, but because they don't know how to deal with it." I took a sip of my coffee, processing her words. "And what do you think?" She looked at me sincerely. "I think you did the right thing. And I think Rodriguez brought it on himself. But I also think that now the responsibility is yours. People are watching you, Carlos. You're now the man who made Rodriguez leave." Her words stayed with me long after we finished our coffee. That phrase haunted me for weeks. No matter how hard I tried to move on with my life, I noticed the stares, the whispers, the sense that some people saw me as the one who had brought conflict to a place that was once peaceful. But what did that peace really mean? Did it mean we all stayed silent in the face of discrimination? Did it mean we accepted racism with a forced smile and went on with our lives as if nothing was wrong? No, that wasn't the peace I wanted. So I made a decision. Months later, Rodriguez's house was sold. One day, while I was taking out the trash, I saw a moving truck parked in front of the house. A young man stepped out of the cab with a smile on his face. "Hello, neighbor," he greeted me as they unloaded the furniture. "My name's Andres." I greeted him back with a smile. The neighborhood was changing, and this time, for the better. In the end, the story wasn't just about a racist neighbor who called the police to try to kick me out of my own home. It was about what happened next, about how an act of injustice brought deeper problems to light, about how people, when faced with the reality, had to decide which side they wanted to be on, about how some chose to leave and others decided to stay and build something better, and about how, through it all, I discovered my voice had more power than I'd imagined. Because sometimes, change doesn't start with big speeches or revolutions. It starts with a simple decision, not staying silent. Instead of hiding, instead of waiting for things to go back to normal, I decided to do something different. I spoke with Pedro and some neighbors who had supported me, and together we organized a community meeting. Not to talk about what had happened with Rodriguez, but to talk about the future of the neighborhood. We called everyone, regardless of their opinion on what had happened. The meeting was uncomfortable at first. Some people arrived with crossed arms, tense expressions. But as we spoke, as we listened to each other, something began to change. Not everyone agreed on everything, but for the first time, people started talking about issues they had avoided before. We talked about discrimination, about integration, about how we could make the neighborhood a more welcoming place for everyone. And most importantly, we listened to each other. We didn't convince everyone, but we did start a conversation. And sometimes, that's enough to begin changing something.